Great, thank you. Just a reminder for those inveterate tweeters here, the hashtag is USC Creativity. People have been sending tweets, and they know what's been going on here. So we'll keep that up if you don't mind. This is a great panel on a very juicy topic. I'm hoping that we'll have maximal conversation with you all. And in order to maximize that, I am going to minimize, with the indulgence of the panel, the lengths of the introductions. You have them all with you. I'm just going to mention, in a couple of key cases, some relevant engagement with our topic. Phil Ethington, who is here on my left, among other things, is also currently the chair at USC of the Joint Provost Senate University Research Committee. And Sri Narayanan is the former chair of that committee. So we have some continuity here on that front. Marty Levine is the vice provost for faculty affairs, which is certainly relevant to what we're up to here. Jen Giuliani is the Senior Associate Dean for Research and Technology at SPPD, so in addition to her own work, is looking at the conduct of research. Terry Sanger runs with a colleague something called, many of you may know, the Health Sciences and Technology Institute Center, which is a partnership of Keck and Viterbi. And so lots of other credits and lots of other reasons first to ask me to have you thank them for being here. So there is nothing wrong with independent, traditional, solo scholarship. Okay? So we're stipulating that that practice, which has been a mainstay of intellectual life and universities for a very long time, is something which is worth rewarding and encouraging. That having been said, we have been talking here today about collaboration, about digital scholarship, which is both an end in itself and an aspect of collaboration, and also to some degree innovation and creativity. So the question we're focusing on here has to do with collaboration, digital scholarship, innovation, and creativity. The survey, I'll just remind you of those who responded who came here today, but also the universally most important topic to people who came to the workshops we ran last spring, is that in order to accomplish these goals, the tenure guidelines should be revised to reward creativity and encourage collaboration. So where does USC fit in that larger scheme? Where are our issues in that in a larger context? I'm just going to give you 3 other data points, and then I'm going to ask the panelists to first start with a diagnosis of where things are now. So the 3 other data points. The American Council of Learned Societies did a task force on the topic of collaborative research. And here is a quote from its report. In the most elite universities, traditional scholarly work in the form of a single-authored printed book or article published by a university press or scholarly society is the currency of tenure and promotion. Work online or in new media, especially work involving collaboration, is not encouraged. The Modern Language Association did a task force report and survey on the same topic, on collaboration. This was also empirically based. They did survey research across a number of institutions. And I'll just quote one fact from it. Asked about inexperience in evaluating scholarly monographs in electronic formats. 2/3 of doctoral granting departments report that they have no experience. Finally, at the Institute of Medicine, a workshop was held this year called Extending the Spectrum of Pre-Competitive Collaboration in Oncology Research. And at that workshop, just one comment, after discussing all of the virtues of collaboration and how to reward it, the vice dean of the med school at University of California in San Francisco said this: "The merit, tenure, and promotion processes in the university undermine everything we are trying to accomplish here." So that's a gradient. We're going to talk about how to get from here to there, but I thought we might start by just talking about here. What's your assessment, your diagnosis of where we are on these issues? Sri, want to take that?
Sure. So I'll start with the most obvious statement, right? So we started with how do you evaluate research? So typically, people believe, credit follows effort. It's a very simple principle, but it's principle is there, but operationalizing the principle is very hard. One, because the nature of collaboration across fields and across disciplines, across people, is very heterogeneous. It's very hard to dissociate things like if you look at one of the statements things that we looked at is NIH has guidelines how to do team science, how to evaluate team science. There you can ask questions about who conceived this idea, who ran the data processing, who ran the experiment, what impact does it have, and so on. These kinds of, we can ask questions of the people, and we can get some answers. But in several other domains, right, it's very hard to dissociate, how ideas were created and implemented. For example, one of the things I want to ask Marty himself, right, among many hats he wears, in creative collaboration and collaborative creativity, screenwriting. I have this fantastic view of people sitting doing screenplays in the for TV shows, down in a lot of coffee, eating a lot of donuts, and coming up with the jokes that will fly. Right? How are credit assigned, and how do you evaluate? That happens in a lot of fields, right? How ideas are conceptualized and so on. So this whole notion of heterogeneity in the nature of collaboration and heterogeneity in how perceptions are formed. Because at some level, right, whether, let's take this 10-year promotion process, it's value judgment people place. Because we try to standardize a process that's fairly, broad and, and diverse to something that a collective set of people say, well, is it useful, important in some way? And that process is dangerous, particularly, more and more there's diversity in how you implement it and what you implement. So at USC, we've been talking about this quite a bit. One principle, is to see, be as broad-minded and be flexible and adaptive. How you value the usefulness of products and processes of people, and two, involve the people who are in the who create this process being evaluated as a process of assessment. You look at Google or or any industry research, right? People Anne might add something for Xerox PARC. How evaluation is done in these very creative environments, very collaborative. People do self-assessment quite a bit, and there's peer assessment and so on. So these kinds of new ways of actually evaluation, we should be open to those. So I'll stop there for now. Yeah.
I did want to apologize to Tom Jordan, who I did not at this point introduce, but I hope you got to meet earlier in the day as he was asking a couple of questions. Sorry, I apologize for leaving you out at the beginning. It's your cue.
So that's my cue, I guess.
Yes.
Well, I think we have to step back and ask, let's recall what we're trying to do here. I think we're going to focus probably on the tenure process. Mm-hmm. There are a number of other issues we could talk about. For example, how we develop collaboration leadership at USC more generally. But I think a lot of us are concerned about the issues of the tenure process. I suspect there's a wide range of view from what you might call the very conservative to the more liberal version. I would put myself in the more conservative camp, I think, at this point, to recall that the reason why we have rigorous tenure processes is because the university is making a very big bet on a person. And we're trying to, we can talk about type 1 and type 2 errors. Type 1 error is a false positive. We have incorrectly identified a scholar of great merit. And of course, type 2 is we didn't properly identify that person. The way these systems have worked in the past is to typically you want to have a small type 1 error because you're putting something like a $5 million bet on the career of this faculty member that you are now going to have for the rest of his or her career. And to evaluate that is a tricky business, as we all know, and very subjective, intrinsically subjective. My view is that what we want to do is assess a scholar's impact at the time of tenure with the notion of the potential for future impact. And in the area I am in, which is in science, I think the mechanisms for doing that are being perturbed by this sort of development of large-scale collaborations, but I don't think they've been overturned by it. And I think we'll get into this more generally. I think I'll just state my my kind of position and then come back to it.
Okay, and I'm going to ask in a moment both Phil and Marty to talk about processes going on here at the university and where we stand. But before I do that, I'd just like to ask Jen or Terry if you'd like to comment on the current state of affairs in the way in which the appointment, promotion, and tenure process relates to this goal of collaboration.
Shall I? This is after that wonderful movie. How can you make this interesting, right? So I'm going to throw out a few ideas that may make this interesting, I hope. And this is simply my observations, having been through more than one tenure case in the past 10 years or so. And my point basically is about conservatism, the conservatism that Tom Jordan actually brought up. And that is that tenure, I think, at USC and at most other places is highly conservative. And it's not highly conservative just because you're betting on the person, but you're betting on the university's reputation. In the scheme of things, that's what you're really betting on. And in a university that wishes to go up in the rankings, the peer group are the people at the top, and the people at the top may, most of the time, be extremely conservative. That is to say that disciplines rule, that sole authorship rules, that you take a very conservative approach to evaluating anybody because you want to err. Your type 1 errors are really important if you want to move up, because if you make too many, the university is not going to move up. And so what does that do? Well, it builds in this sort of tradition of really big difficulties in changing the rules. And this is built in because you're going to go to very senior peer reviewers who are going to have bought in with the traditional point of view and so on and so forth. So it's a self-strengthening system. And then who can be the innovators here? In my view, it is the few universities at the top, because they're now good enough to be able to break the rules and get away with it. And so I would expect to see real changes coming from the very top universities, or those, the ones we consider to be top universities, because they can afford to get away with it. So it's no surprise to me that it was MIT that threw out its OpenCourseware first. That's a risk maneuver that other universities wouldn't take. So I would encourage us to think about how USC could be more risky, less risk-averse.
Terry?
That's a good point.
So one of the things that I worry about a lot in starting up a training program, who, by the way, we changed the name to Health Technology and Engineering. So as we try to get this process going for these students, so what do we tell the students? So I'm trying to think about students who are going to have some kind of combined training in either medicine or engineering and are going to learn to talk to each other, but eventually need jobs. And some of the people are going to be looking for academic jobs. And the problem is when you're on the boundary between two fields, you have no peers. we count on peer review in order to make accurate assessments. You have to have people with expertise in the subject area in order to be able to assess what people do. But if you're trying to create a new collaborative effort or do something that is really on a boundary, hopefully by being new, there really isn't anybody else who has done that before, otherwise it wouldn't be new. So the very existence of a peer group would lessen the status of that person. So now you have the problem of how, of course, do we get evaluated by the two or more fields that are being accommodated. And one of the things that we've noticed in trying to create an educational program about this is the problem is not as much the knowledge base between the two areas. So there's, of course, there's a different knowledge base in medicine and engineering. But the way in which knowledge is created and the way in which knowledge is assessed. And this happens even within medicine. So in a typical example within medicine, is somebody who does bench research might look at somebody who does clinical trials and say, well, that clinical trial stuff, that's really just secretarial, right? You just, that you may have found, proven that we have a new treatment for stroke, but there really wasn't much intellectual effort in that. That's just organization, right? And then the people on the other side will say, well, you've been doing this bench research for years and you've come up with some exciting molecules that, cure cancer in rats, but unless I do the clinical trial for you, your stuff is useless. So what happens is that within the medical field, there is this sort of lack of respect for the different types of research, which comes basically from a lack of understanding. Now try to cross that between engineering and medicine. And there the lack of respect, I will give you real equivalent quotes from people at other institutions. But there was, I heard from somebody, a fairly senior person in the medical field, saying that really medical students at their institution were really very, very smart. And so smart, in fact, that they were pretty sure they could learn anything that the engineers knew. Pretty straightforward. So that really it wasn't obvious that the engineers were going to be able to contribute much because the medical students were so smart that they could just learn this, right? And I heard the same thing on the other side from a very senior person, same institution, in electrical engineering, who said that, well, this is really, really tough. And the things that we do in our engineering classes, the kind of problem sets and the level of expectation of intellectual rigor that we expect is so far beyond what these medical students have ever seen that I don't see how we could possibly expect them to be able to collaborate with us or make a meaningful contribution. We'll go into the hospital, we'll learn what they do, but really we're the ones with the knowledge who will be able to actually make these links. So I think that one of the things that happens, and again, one of the reasons that I really admire USC for what it does, I think we don't have nearly as much of that attitude as other institutions. But the students are going to be going out into this world. And so the students need to understand in the outside world how do they deal with what are essentially built-in prejudices and lack of respect between different fields. And one of the things that I would say in looking at the tenure and promotion process is to make sure that certainly here we provide a model in which people are going to be assessing people whose fields they really don't understand. It's not that they don't have the background knowledge, they really don't understand the thought process. They don't understand why that field is important. And so how can you create objective assessment of something that you don't understand? And I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I think we have to do it because ultimately that's the point. But I think that requires a very different way of thinking about how we learn about what it is people do, how we learn about other fields, and how we learn about how these fields think as we make assessments of individuals who are trying to cross those boundaries.
Thank you. So at USC, one entity which has been wrestling with these questions now for quite a while is the committee that you chair. And I was hoping you could bring us up to date on the state of play.
Okay, great. I'm happy to. Can you hear me? Well, first of all, I actually want to keep the dialogue going here and respond to and comment on a few of these remarks. The comments so far on tenure are very important. One question we need to ask is why do we grant tenure? It's not just to make a permanent investment in a scholar and make a bet on them. Tenure has a function, and the function is to provide that scholar with the guarantee of academic freedom. That's how academic tenure was instituted, and it was instituted because at the beginning of the 20th century, several major scholars across the United States were fired for taking controversial stances on economic questions in particular, advocating socialism. And so Rockefeller, who founded the University of Chicago, started firing economists, and Jane Stanford was firing her sociologists. And so That's a very important principle because what do you do with academic freedom? Well, you have the freedom to take controversial stands, of course, but you also want scholars more generally to be able to take risks. And that's, of course, fundamental to creativity. So one of the things that's paradoxical then about tenure is that until you get it, there's a lot of pressure not to take risks. And so I think one of the things we have to question overall is how we're going to manage that. We want our young scholars to be risk takers and to be bold, and we don't want them to be timid and worried about whether they step out of their disciplinary boundaries or do unusual things with digital technologies or collaborate in unusual ways that they won't be rewarded. So I just want to put that paradox out there. And I also want to comment on the first question, which is, where is USC now? And this is something that the University Research Committee is always keeping an eye on. When I came to USC in 1993, under the new provost, Lloyd Armstrong, one of our two recent visionary provosts, the next was Max Nikias, visionary because they really put the resources of this university behind interdisciplinarity. Interdisciplinarity has been the call and the clarion call really at this university ever since I've been here, and that has led to many, many collaborations. And so I think after we promoted interdisciplinarity for quite a few years, we then were confronted with the question of, well, what do we do with all these collaborators? And I mean it in the good sense, not the post-war sense. So what we found in last year's and then this year's University Research Committee, in considering how we do back this promotion of both interdisciplinarity and collaboration, is that our UCAPT manual, the guidelines for promotion and tenure, and the faculty handbook had embedded in them language that seemed to work against this goal. And so I just want to give you a couple examples of what we found and what I won't read the whole set, but we've written a guidelines now that have gone before the Academic Senate for approval. And I want to say that neither in our University Research Committee nor at the executive board of the Academic Senate was there any resistance to these revisions. I mean, I'm very proud to say that this university continues to meet these efforts with, I believe, encouragement. So very much against, I think, what the ACLS found in general. So here's an example from the UCAPT manual, section 2.1, gauges of quality. The current language, and this has not been revised yet. There's a proposal now to approve to revise this, but it's getting into a final stage. The current language, fundamentally, we want to know whether the candidate has made a real contribution and whether that contribution has made an impact or shows high likelihood of impact on the field and demonstrates focus and independence. Okay, the independence is the problematic word here. So what we decided to do is to replace that with the term originality. Now we have fundamentally, we want to know whether the candidate has made a real contribution and whether that contribution has made an impact or shows high likelihood. So the only thing we changed that one passage was originality, but that makes a very big difference because the independence, until clarified, seems to suggest that the opposite would be some kind of collaboration, but actually the opposite of independence is dependence. You don't want what we're looking for are scholars who show an independent mind, as in independent from their mentors or from knowledge that has already been produced. And so originality is a term that we've been working with. And another problem here is in the question of, well, what do you do with how do we assess this? There's a lot of answers to that question, but the fundamental one we use across the academy is our testimony, that is confidential testimony by recommenders, letters of recommendation or of assessment by evaluation by independent scholars. Well, that's the question, independent. Okay, so I mean disinterested is what I'm actually saying because I just undermined my point. But see how deeply ingrained it is. So here's a passage from the faculty handbook under the section called the dossier. The existing language says, although some of the reviewers may be selected from a list of names provided by the candidate, most should neither be from that list nor have a close personal or professional relation with the candidate. Well, now, if your business as a scientist, social scientist, a humanist, is to collaborate with a lot of scholars, then you have a close professional relationship with them. So ruling them out of your potential list of letter writers seems problematic. So we rewrote this at some length. Here's how we have it now. Although some of the reviewers may be selected from a list of names provided by the candidate, most should not be from that list. Care should be taken to avoid soliciting letters from scholars whose close personal or professional relation with the candidate may predictably bias the scholar's evaluation. However, for scholars who are engaged in collaborative research, care should also be taken to include letters from scholars with whom the candidate has collaborated, and such scholars may necessarily have a close professional relationship with the candidate, we put in parentheses. These letters from co-authoring referees should address the significance of the collaboration in terms of impact on the disciplinary fields involved and the creative contributions of the candidate as a research collaborator and/or author. So those are just a couple examples how status here at USC is changing.
So, Marty, we play this out now from the research committee, and now we are looking at the world from the way you look at it.
Now, I'm not a member of UCAP, but I sit with UCAP all the time. So I was very taken with that 100% figure this morning. I said, oh, it's all our fault. Now, some of Terry's points reminded me of other things. Saul Galam used to say that the way you could tell you had moved from one discipline to a neighboring discipline is when people start saying, that's not research. And about evaluating someone else's work, right? In the music school, you hear things like, well, I play violin and she does viola. How could I possibly evaluate the quality of her work? I mean, it's so different. So Phil's committee's recommendations have been very useful to UCAP, which is now working on the next edition. You know, every couple of years a new edition comes out. Independence has always been interpreted to mean primarily independence from your mentors, and that's how UCAP applies it, but that can be made clear. And the UCAP manual has for many, many years said just the things about letters from collaborators that Phil would like the handbook to say also. You know, when you're making this multi-million-dollar lifetime investment bet, as Tom puts it, you need evidence. And the difference between type 1 and type 2 errors is that once you've spent that money, you can't spend it again. If you fill the tenured position, you can't hire the next person who might be better. And the person you've just hired is going to be voting on tenure decisions for the next umpteen years. So you only have to make a few decisions wrong in the same department and it's over. So it's a hard decision. And the members of UCAP are interchangeable with the research committee or other major committees. They're very good scholars. It's a very diverse group. They themselves do all kinds of scholarship. They're diverse in many other ways. Some of the basic questions that they have to face about a candidate is, what did she do and how good is it? Now, if there's a single authored work, you know what the person did, it's there. And in evaluating it, the first cuts on peer review have been done by the editorial board of the journal or the press or the study group that gave a score to the proposal. So you go into the process with some external, national or international peer review where people put their money where their mouth is, and you know that those judgments are what they really mean. Now, if someone has done all collaborative work, first question is, well, what did this person do in that big project? And then you don't have that separate external peer review because what the other peer review processes did were of the collaborative work product. So it's much harder. Now, the way that UCAPT has sought evidence before is exactly from letters from collaborators. And in the new edition, it will be spelled out even more clearly. The candidate is invited to explain in detail, what did you contribute to that joint project? The department is reminded to seek letters from collaborators exactly on those questions. And for a number of years, there's been a special letter suggested to go to those collaborators. And then the departmental committee and the department as a whole are asked to address those questions. So, looking for the evidence. Now, as to risk-taking, well, you know, if you're mentoring an assistant professor, I don't know that the best advice to take is, oh, this is the good time in your career to take risks. Okay, take your risks, but you know, the risk of failure when you're an assistant professor is that when the time comes to evaluate your record, it won't look very good. When you have tenure, the time frame is much longer. The time frame is your whole career. And if your reputation goes down for a few years, well, it may go up a few years later. So your time frame for taking risks is very different. I don't know about academic freedom. We guarantee academic freedom to everybody. We do not say that assistant professors don't have academic freedom or non-tenure track faculty don't have academic freedom. If there ever were a political case, you know, we'd fight to defend everyone's academic freedom. But the freedom to make mistakes, the freedom to waste your time for 5 years because a whole line of research doesn't pan out, well, the problem with being an assistant professor and trying to take that risk is when the time comes to look at the evidence, maybe the evidence won't be there.
Let me talk about a different kind of risk, which is implicit in the discussions we've been having today, which is digital scholarship and new forms of scholarship.
Easy answer. In principle, they're identical. Who cares? You know, who cares the format? It's like large pages or small pages. You know? But however, you ask about any venue, you say, you know, what's the ratio between submissions and acceptances? Who's on the editorial board? Who else chooses to publish there? Who reads this stuff? Who makes use of it? There are certain venues that over a period of time have established excellent reputations for the quality of their peer review.
But now, Marty, let me interrupt.
Yeah.
That's the easy way, easy part of it. Yeah. Let me ask the harder form of it, which is people, and the ACLS made a strong point about this. What about people who create online repositories, online tools for scholars in the field, infrastructures for collaborative research, games, websites? All those things are acts of digital scholarship, which, according to the ACLS, especially at this stage in the development of it, is as important to build that infrastructure as it is to create papers.
Let me say a quick answer, because you addressed it to me, and then we'll let Tom and others speak. Games, well, games are different. You know, games are like movies. So games are like other works of art. So you evaluate it like any other work of art. Creating infrastructures for other people? Oh, wait, that's sort of like translations. You know, that's providing the raw material that someone will use for really creative works of scholarship. But if you want to explain that that itself is a work of scholarship, digital or not digital, you better make that case.
Do you all agree with Marty that that's a case that needs to be made?
Certainly.
Yes.
Because you know, if it's a high impact work, right, that because you're creating this resource for someone to work on, that itself creates impact. Impact is a word we hear a lot, right? How much has it impacted the field, and broadly, you know, other fields? You know, if we can measure that, then that makes a case. If not, Tom answer.
Well, okay, so I want to comment on that because I think this question of impact is the real nexus of the problem. And we have to admit that in collaborative structures, that is kind of a layered problem. Okay, in fact, that's why the redrafting of the language in your second point, Phil, is so important. And Marty alluded to this. I think we're on the same page in wanting, in the way we can evaluate an individual's contribution within a collaboration. You have to go to the opinion brokers within the collaboration, which is why I asked the question this morning about opinion brokering, because frankly, you have to do that. I remember I was on a tenure evaluation for an MIT professor, young professor in physics. His only papers were co-authored with 400 people, or he had some papers with 1,000 people. He was listed alphabetically in that authorship list, and the question in front of the tenure committee was, you know, how much did he contribute? The only way you can figure that out, find out, is by going to people embedded within the collaboration who can assess this, and hopefully will do so in an objective way. But the next, the other problem is assessing the collaboration. In other words, the impact, the absolute impact, is going to depend on the absolute impact of the collaboration as well as the relative contributions of the individual within it. Let's take some examples. Look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That is an activity that has tremendous impact. I think we can agree. Of course, recently controversial. I was just reading in Science, in Working Group 1, which is the science part of that process, the number of people involved in the first assessment was about 250. The number involved in the fourth assessment was over 600. And there's now over 1,300 people involved in the IPCC. So it's clear that that is an important collaboration. The impact is very high. And if somebody is making an important contribution within that collaboration, that can be assessed and I think can assign a suitably high value. So it means that here at the university we have to be especially diligent, not only in evaluating relative contributions, but also the absolute impact of these various activities. We can't presume that they have high impact.
Can I add something to that? The question of repositories, databases that a great deal of new important science and scholarship is coming from, really goes to the question of libraries and what librarians have always done. I see a couple of my librarian colleagues in the room here. Now, the irony is that for years, librarians were producing really valuable repositories and struggling to be recognized as scholars or as faculty. And now with the larger realm of information science, where scholars are more involved in creating these databases, I think we have to reassess the difference between an archive and something that is a work of scholarship, and what is the Tom's point of is there an impact that can be felt in the scholarly scientific world from this repository, or the use of it, or its originality. I think originality and creativity in the production of it is probably one of the key criteria. But we should reflect actually on what librarians have contributed and how they're actually very involved in the co-production of these things.
Before we start audience questions, I wanted to make sure if anyone wanted to comment on where we are now. Shri?
So can I add one more part to this risk that you mentioned about this evaluation? So I think the pragmatic view that Marty shared, we are giving about 5-6 years of to show the impact of a person's work to say whether there will be a tenured colleague at the university. So collaboration, it's not only you're taking a risky thing where after the fact evaluation becomes difficult, but even during the process there are other dangers involved. Potentially these collaborative projects could be high risk, high payoff category, but that depends on a lot of people that you don't have enough error correction time to control. Say someone decides, okay, they don't want to participate, pull out of this for some odd reason. Lots of personality, and I want to quote my friend Doe. It's not she said it's all human at the end. So if someone it just doesn't work out, there's not enough room to actually maneuver and get back on track. So that's another risk and danger. But of course, high risk, high payoff is always nice. You can make a splash, New York Times or something with your work. But perhaps pragmatism becomes useful at some point.
Is it out of order to? Kathy Rowe had a point in the middle of our repository question. Do you want to?
I'm just
Save a
could
minute?
you hang on just for a second?
Okay.
But I appreciate the help. Jen and Terry?
I was going to get back to the idea of what do we do with these new forms of creating things, the sort of new media things that you've all been talking about. And if I were to sort of take that question and put it into old media kind of ideas, it would still come down to what is the intellectual contribution at the end of the day. And so I can, in my own field, we may build models. And they may be available for all kinds of people to use after we build them, right? And if that's simply a mechanical exercise, it's one thing. But if it has some intellectual contribution there, then it's a really neat thing. And people using it and creating other products from it is neat too. If I take the example of a database, okay? I learned today that metadata in the engineering world is documentation in my world. And so suppose I take it upon myself to document a database in a way that everybody else can now use it, right? That's a great altruistic thing for me to do. But unless I have created some intellectually creative way of documentation, it really isn't much of an intellectual contribution. So it may be that some of the rules of the game here do translate, even though they are in new media that we don't know very much about at this point in time.
Terry?
Yeah, I was actually going to say something very similar, because I think you want to distinguish between the tools that you use to discover new knowledge and the knowledge that's discovered using those tools. And sometimes building the tool itself requires the discovery of new knowledge, and so that would then be considered scholarship and intellectual effort. But if it's a tool that simply requires a lot of work, but fundamentally is something that lots of people could have done, and your goal is just to hand it to the outside world and see if other people come up with clever ways of using it, it would be harder to justify that as scholarship. Where I think this becomes relevant in collaborative work is it raises the question of why did you collaborate with somebody? So if I create a very clever tool, but I have no idea what it could be used for, and I search for collaborators who have a bright idea of how this could actually change the world, really they're doing the intellectual effort, not me. Right? Whereas at the same time, if I have a great idea, but I have no idea how to go about building the thing, and I find somebody who can basically engineer this for me, then maybe I should get credit for the intellectual effort. But if in the process of doing that, the thing I asked this other person to build required them to develop a whole new field of mathematics, then they get some credit for that too. So I think what we're looking at is, as you say, the basic concept of scholarship doesn't change, right? This is about intellectual effort, creativity, leadership, and you have to be able to evaluate that. It may actually be a harder evaluation process within sort of electronic or the technological domain, where really it's about making things, but sometimes even the most useful tool that changes the world did not require intellectual effort in its creation. The intellectual effort may have been in the identification of the need for that tool, and then you have to decide whether or not that constitutes scholarship.
Thank you. I'm going to try to get as many questions in as we can, which means that both the questions and the answers or comments should be as brief as possible. Catherine, did you want to start?
Yes, I don't have a mic, but I'm back to media translation again, and just the gains and challenges of this kind of comparison between new forms of productivity and older forms of productivity. There's always a gap, right? Games now might actually be a form of argument, not just a form of entertainment. A film might be a form of an essay, right? Not purely a artistic creative act in the mode that we've been thinking about visual art for so long. So that one of the consequences, it seems to me, for reviewing and reappointment protocols ought to be to think about whether a query to peer reviewers for a file involves the question, what is the appropriate mode of comparison for thinking about this new genre? Can you make a case that a game ought to be thought of as equivalent to an essay rather than equivalent to a film? In other words, one might then outsource to the reviewers, as we regularly do in reappointment, the way Marty described, the question of what's the appropriate arena of comparison. And I would say, in the design of digital tools, one might look at the design of new scientific processes. If one of your colleagues in a diabetes lab creates a new gene knockout process that's adopted by 100 labs around the country, do you think of that as a reviewable and very valuable kind of scholarship? I think the answer is probably yes. Probably even if they develop a new knockout mouse that 100 labs are using, that's just a tool, but it counts. So one wants to look very broadly, and the risk of media translation is that one looks narrowly at one's own familiar genres rather than across disciplines for other genres.
If I could ask the indulgence of the panel to hold off on responses, let's pick up a few more comments. Yes.
Hi, Parag Malik from Keck. So I have two related questions. The first is, I hear this phrase impact from many of you. What do you mean by impact? How do you quantify impact? What is impact? And then the related question has to do with different forms of product. Recently, Ferran Adrià, who's a chef from Spain, was hired at Harvard. His products are recipes. How would you even quantify the impact of foam on culture?
Can I just answer one part of that, since my daughter is in that course? The chef is a consultant. The actual professor is the chair of the applied mathematics department. And the rigor of science required of the students is terrifying to those students. So it may sound like a walk in the park or a taste of the pudding or whatever, but it's not quite entirely that. I'm going to let's hold the question of impact as well. I'd like to just pick up a few more to get some issues on the table. Anne.
Okay, here's another issue. And the issue is about, I've got to go back to Rosalind Franklin's contribution to Crick and Watson's. You know, at the time when she produced the photographs, the regime of knowledge was she was just producing the photographs. And it wasn't until many years later that her contribution to the knowledge formation that led to the theorization of the double helix was actually seen to be a kind of critical part of that. So we have to be aware of that our moment of our judgment of what's critical or not, what's a tool and what's the content, are always kind of bound by our blinders that we have at the moment. This happens to be a very old story for women in the production of knowledge, that what they are seen to be doing is often the gut or the scut work that doesn't count as kind of the real knowledge production. So it's an old history an old story in the kind of history, feminist history of science and technology. Which leads to the second point. I wish post-tenure was as ideal as you guys are making it.
Let the record show.
Yes. As a tenured faculty member who was harassed out of a university, there are many ways in which whatever that $5 million is, they can cut their losses. If you get a little too uppity or you take the institution to task for behaving badly. And again, this is a price that people have paid, regardless of the intellectual content, for keeping the universities honest in terms of their protocols or their treatment of women or their treatment of minorities and so on. So there are many ways in which that is not a contract for life, and people don't get that kind of golden, whatever you might call it. So I want to call the disingenuousness about a $5 million investment. If the university wants to move you, they can make your life incredibly unpleasant, even as a tenured faculty.
The reason I love these comments, from my background in the entertainment industry, without conflict, no drama. And it's good to have some drama. So I'm going to ask for any quick responses to any aspect of this. Terry and then Sri.
Well, I'd just like to respond to that a little bit, because I think you're right. I mean, the first point I was making, which is that I think a lot of the fundamental problems in collaboration are due to lack of respect across fields. And I think the issue you're raising is lack of respect across gender, which could extend to race and culture as well. To collaborate with anybody, the first step is respect. And I think the point you make about respect for the different types of research and the different types of data that are produced by different types of work, and the contribution of all of that is very important. So while I do think it's important to be able to distinguish between sort of production of a tool which in itself does not require the same kind of intellectual effort, at the same time, how you get to make that decision and who gets to make that decision is a very tricky issue, right? Because again, you can make both the type 1 and type 2 errors in evaluating any piece of this. And so the problem again is you're always dealing with people, you're always being evaluated by people from a different field or from a different background or race, culture, or gender. And so how you allow that to happen. So without making this into solving the world's problems in order to make tenure decisions easier, I think the idea is still that these problems become very, very relevant and maybe are amplified when you're looking at collaborative and group efforts.
Thank you, Sri.
So one thing I want to add, there was a slide that Anne showed, rules of engagement. That was brilliant. In fact, that actually triggered me about if any of those rules of engagement are broken or tampered with, particularly during the young stages of a career, right? The relative effect can be larger. It doesn't mean that post-tenure, people don't suffer from the same kinds of things. Very good point that Anne made. The other thing is broader question of tools and best practices of evaluation of these things, particularly when you have these very fluid types of very new ways of doing scholarship, that's emerging. And are we all ready? It's easy if you have a well set set of guidelines and rules to follow, and people are able to, even from outside the field, to evaluate. But do we have the right sets of tools and best practices to actually take on this process? For example, when I was reading the MLA, right, their guidelines, they say, well, this is good to do, but they think, for example, the grass is always greener. They think, the sciences, physics, and
yes.
They have their best practices well laid out. Maybe we should learn from them. That gave me a chuckle because I said, well, that's interesting. And so this is actually an ongoing thing, and that goes back. If we want to take on a risky thing of showing, trailing the place, maybe this is an opportunity. In fact, going back.
Jen and then Marty.
Yeah.
Okay.
First, I really appreciate the comments that I heard just now. And to me, they're all kind of different perspectives or views of this kind of fundamental issue to me of conservatism, that it's really hard to change anything in a university. And we're actually dealing with two big challenges here, to me, not one. One is the proliferation of media and new ways and all the things we heard this morning. And then there's this issue of collaboration and, quote, multidisciplinary, quote, interdisciplinary research. And in both cases, it's the question of how do you assign value to something you haven't figured out before? And how can you do that in a way that assures you that you are minimizing your risks? And I think I really applaud what UCAPT has done so far, what I'm hearing has been done, but I think that's the real fundamental here, that we have to have a sort of a commitment to kind of change the conservatism of the institution itself in these ways.
That's your cue, Marty.
Is your school conservative?
Yes.
I thought lawyers never asked questions they didn't know the answers to.
One of the wonderful things about the University Committee on Appointment, Promotion, and Tenure, it's not conservative, it's not bound to the traditions of any one discipline. If someone seems to be a wonderful hire for the university, what does that committee care if it doesn't fit into that department? Maybe the person can fit into a different department. But yes, some departments are more innovative, others are more hesitant to make changes. Let me answer the question on impact.
Great.
There's
Great.
an answer. There are different kinds of evidence. The very best is when referees writing back in their letters say, I changed how I do things in my lab when I read her paper on so-and-so. I used to think X, and now she's written a paper that says anti-X. well, I still think I'm right and she's wrong, but I'm not so sure now, and I'm going to have to do more research on this. We now assign that book on our doctoral reading list. You didn't have to send me the articles. I had read them already, and I assigned them to my students. Okay. That's terrific evidence of impact. Next level down, when referees don't give that detailed data, but just say, this person has a huge impact in our field. Things have changed totally. So that's a claim rather than data, but if you see it in several letters, you may tend to believe it. Third type of evidence, citation count. You have to evaluate the citations. You have to, why were they cited, and what's normal in that field, and what kind of thing was being cited. But one person has 1,000 hits, and another person has 10, and it's some evidence. There are dossiers where none of this evidence is there. Where, as near as you can tell, no one cares about this person's life's work. Well, that's not so good. And there are other dossiers where you just see that someone, as an assistant professor, has done work which the full professors around the country or the knowledge leaders of the field regard as peer work. That's wonderful. One of the most delightful parts about serving on UCAP, and those of you who have been members of UCAP know this, are reading the terrific dossiers. There were a large fraction of the cases. The people are so wonderful. And you just know that USC 10 years from now is going to be even better than it was 10 years ago because of these terrific people who are getting tenure. Borderline cases, whether you call them one way or another, don't give you that feeling.
Who here is confident that their comment or question only would take a minute? Yes, Tara.
I'm really interested in some kind of disconnect between Dr. Bemit's kind of conclusion at the end of his lunchtime presentation that new modes of data sets mean synthetic knowledge needs to be valued, that there are ways that aggregating knowledge is as useful as originality, and everything I'm hearing on the panel today as we talk about promotion and tenure. So, under a minute.
May I answer that?
Sure.
Actually, I think it's not that bad of a problem in the sense that, at least in the environment that I'm in, which is one where we are using more and more of these new tools, where the synthesis simulations and things like that are more and more important, I think young people are getting a lot of credit for moving the field forward in that area.
Can I answer in a different way? I want to go back to this the recognition we made to the single scholar model, and I want to call it a little into question here. That model really comes from the Romantic era of the genius Mozart or Beethoven or Goethe who get their inspiration from God, and sit in a room and just think great thoughts and the light bulb goes off their head. Who among us really do that? I mean, haven't we all been collaborators all along? I mean, when I read Georg Simmel from the early 20th century, and I have an idea that I couldn't have had apart from having read Simmel, aren't I collaborating with him in a sense? Aren't we collaborating when we work together in seminars and we didn't call ourselves collaborators, but I came out of that seminar with a new idea of some sort? So I think we should actually not pay too much respect to that romantic genius model and recognize the generalized collaboration that we do every day.
In a moment, we're going to try to braid some of the strands that we have been listening to today. I just wanted to quote something coming out of the research committee, which strikes me as predicting or requiring next steps. To reflect the value that this is a recommendation number 1 from your committee, to reflect the value that USC places on collaborative research, the evaluative committees in schools and units will need to develop fair and consistent standards for assessing the quality, volume, extent, and impact of the collaborative activity of a faculty member. So that is the charge by the university to itself to proceed through all the diversity of all the schools and all the disciplines. But I would like to conclude this panel by asking you to thank these risk takers for talking about such a third rail question. No problem. I'm just going to continue from here. Thank you all. Sure. So one question is, what's going to come out of all of this? And there are lots of different answers. In some ways, that answer is up to all of you who are at your various schools and departments and who have the ears of other people here who are on various committees, both within and across disciplines and schools. From us, the organizers, we will be giving you as many tools as we can, even though we know it may not be something that would get us tenure. We are going to provide videos of all of the sessions. We're going to provide the stuff that Lloyd has been drawing, and if you look at what Lloyd's up to right now in the upper left-hand corner, Lloyd, if you could just make sure that people can see in that circle the face that symbolizes the conversation we've just had. We will have that. We will have that for you in digital form, and we'll also have a range of rich, interactive web resources, bibliographies, papers, aggregates, ideally some cool new tools that we can use to make it a collaborative, continuing, living document, as Roger was saying earlier. We're also looking for ways to engage you in continuing feedback, whether it's through the Twitter feed or bulletin boards or any other ways that we can marshal technology that you might want to use. But in the most traditional sense, we will also have a summary, a thoughtful summary of what's been going on here. And as a preview of that, I would like just very briefly to put David Bowyer on the spot and give us a little bit of a sense of what you've been hearing.
Well, thanks. I generally prefer to do this in the privacy of my solo operation. And so this is the audacity of a near real-time first draft summary. But a few thoughts. I mean, I think this has been a very brave conference in candidly confronting some very complicated and profound challenges, because I think we're stuck in this interregnum between different modes of scholarship. We're moving from scholarship in which the media has been one of scarcity to one of abundance, and so the challenges become quite different about how to manage that abundance versus scarcity. Different warranting structures for what's valuable, what's credible, what's truth, and new and different tools for research and scholarship. So while many of these are technical, legal, and institutional issues, in some ways at bottom they're social and cultural issues. And I think the decisive issues are going to be in negotiating new sorts of social practices and institutional architectures for managing them. For me, I was listening closely, and sort of three unresolved cross-cutting questions appeared to me. One is, who are the primary agents of change for stimulating collaborative research in the academy, and what strategies should they use? How can fledgling projects and ideas in collaborative research be supported, scaled, and sustained? And how do we imagine new social roles and identities, and what design principles should guide us? And in thinking that through, two things occurred to me. One is, in some ways, the DNA of the academy helps us answer those. It's just we need to see how the academy is being recontextualized in a different context. And second, I do a lot of work studying the commons, and I think of certain basic principles that are present in the design of different commons structures. I think of people like political scientist Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics by studying, well, what are the design principles for successful commonses? or people like Yochai Benkler, who has written extensively about the online world in a theoretical way, how they're governed. Because essentially we need some taxonomy and governance structures for understanding these things. But then I think we also need to recognize that this is, after all, about entirely new genres of knowledge that are being created, but we just don't know the character of the social and institutional containers for them. So it's only natural that we'd be disoriented and confused, as I think many of us, including myself, often are. But I've been mightily illuminated by the quality of this conversation, and I hope my summary can help depict fairly the different sides and complexities of the whole conference. So thank you.
In a moment, you're going to have a terrific opportunity to lobby David to see this day the way you did. And the same is true for Lloyd's work. You didn't quite get what I was saying here, or why didn't you put my important point down here? So all of his work will be out there. David will be out there. All of us will be out there. Calories and caffeine will be out there. But before we get to, and we encourage you, please, to stay and not rush off, even though I know traffic is on everyone's mind. But before we move to that stage, I'd like to invite Randy, who opened us, to do the bookend.
Thank you. So as we've been going through today, I've been making notes of my, I'll call them meta tags for what's been said today. And so just some of the key words that I saw today that I thought were influential. The role of anonymity, curation, mashups of data, rotting data, dynamic content, transmedia, machines talking to humans, humans talking to machines, economies of scarcity, risk-taking, opinion brokering. Actually, my two favorite quotes were toward the end of today. Marty, without conflict, no drama. I think that's a good phrase for all of us. And for Sri, we never got the question answered, but he asked the question, how are jokes assigned credit anyway? I'm not sure. Maybe that's what we'll get answered in the break. But of course, that is an analogy to how do we get credit for whatever we do in the university. Just one other thought to close out. We often think of universities as institutions that are everlasting, and perhaps that has been true. These are the oldest institutions in the world. But not all institutions stay forever. I'll go back to the time when I was working on my Selectric typewriter from IBM. IBM was maybe thinking about other typewriter makers and how they have the best typewriter on the market. Now pretty much no one cares about typewriters. But if you look at other industries, Kodak, making film, didn't have a whole lot of competition. ABC, maybe thinking about NBC and CBS, but not about much other than those two networks. Los Angeles Times, they probably didn't think they were competing against anyone. They were just a monopoly in the market here in Los Angeles. My first job out of college was, in fact, working for General Motors. And that was a period when they were starting to see foreign competition, and they were on a downward trend. But in the 70s, they really only thought about Ford and Chrysler. And it wasn't surprising, having worked at General Motors, that they were not doing well. And if you worked in that industry, you could sense the conservatism of that industry. Recognizing there was change, but not really knowing how to make that change. The only thing that really surprised me about GM is it took them 25 more years to go bankrupt. And they did do that recently, and perhaps they'll survive with the government intervention. So I bring this up not entirely in humor. Universities do face challenges from the outside. We are not the only institutions that create innovation. We're not the only institutions that create research. And while we do things pretty well and we do things that are special, it's not necessarily the case that we will always be the leaders in innovation. And I want to just go back to my initial comment about the chunks in which we produce our research. And we were at a time, perhaps a few decades ago, where the chunk of product was either a peer-reviewed publication in print form or the peer-reviewed book, also in print form. Clearly, those print forms have changed. That's not the way we're primarily distributing our information. Much of what we do is text, but it's not always text today. It may be in data sets, it may be in terms of models, it may be in things that change over time. One thing that's clear is that those boundaries are not so clear as they were in the past, and because those boundaries are not so clear, it is that much harder to evaluate what we're doing. The thing that we have to always be cognizant of is that our own conservatism based on the past does not drive our future, and that we have to go back to the basic principle that as a university we're all about creating knowledge and disseminating knowledge. And the issue is, how do we do that best and stay at the top of that game? So that's my ending comment. Marty, do you have another word?
Just to ask you to applaud yourself for staying with it for the day. Thank you. Please join us outside.